In terms of like what is actually the best thing to do, I mean, I think you've got to persuade some billionaires to back you. And strangely, there's actually a number of libertarian adjacent billionaires out there, so this isn't just a pipe dream. I mean, honestly, if I were someone that really wanted to do it, I would be making a list of billionaires and talking to other billionaires and saying, well, who else do you know that's really rich? Once you know one really rich person, they know each other. I'm just on the edge of these incredible pillars of massive wealth, but to realize that they've got what the means to go and try a lot of incredible ideas. You just got to make friends with them and do it credibly.
Befriend a billionaire. Now,
yeah, I advise everyone to do it.
Yeah, if you do one thing this week.
They're just human beings like you and me. They want friends.
So you've both focused a lot on economic and consequentialist arguments for liberty. But I've found that many people I've spoken to find the moral case, more intuitively compelling. So don't you think that something is being lost by leading these conversations primarily with the consequentialist case?
People say that the moral arguments are all that actually matters, or strictly speaking, that would be deontological arguments, because consequentialist arguments are moral arguments too. But I've noticed that people say this, then never shut up about specific issues. You can go over to the Mises Institute where officially it's all driven by praxeology, and you say, okay, yeah, but what about cobalt? And they don't just say, well, I already have the proof for all industries for all time, so that's it. Instead, if you bring up cobalt, they'll start trying to tell you about some facts about cobalt, and like, well, if the only thing that matters is the deontology, then why do you bother learning any facts? I think the most reasonable position is the one that is laid out in Mike Humer's book, The Problem of Political Authority. There is a weak deontological principle, a presumption of liberty that is reasonable, but that still leaves you totally open to the liberty would work so badly here that we shouldn't do it. So I think that's the real role of economics, and in practice, that how that actually plays out. Even people who officially are totally consequentialist, they too have some deontological moral principles that if you listen to them, they're applying. And then the real thing is, how can we be good at thinking about when to make exceptions or if to make exceptions? And that's where social science is absolutely, totally vital. And if you don't know that stuff, then it's really hard to actually talk about these issues. Like I said, I mean, notice a lot of people say they're deontologists, but then when you bring up specific issues, they still don't want to just say follows from the principle, that's the end of the discussion. They want to bring up details. Sadly, often they don't really know much about the details, or they just have some totally wrong story about it. I mean, just one example of note is almost everyone thinks that it kind of matters whether the American working class has been getting poorer or not in recent decades. People that have an opinion on this usually just default to it's obviously true that everything's gotten much worse. People who know the facts will say at minimum it's a lot more complicated than that, and by many measures actually the entire distribution's doing better. So what do we say about that?
I think my other experience is that if you try to set up hard cases for the asserted principles, people generally try to find some way of getting around them. And my standard one is Bill Bradford's, that many of you have probably heard by now, where you fall off your 10th story apartment balcony, grab onto a flagpole on the 9th floor, and then the owner of that apartment asks you to let go because you don't have his permission. And I don't think I know anybody who would actually let go, or even, I'm not sure I know anybody who
didn't Walter Block say he would let go? I think he did.
I'm not sure. That might be. But I hope he wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, so by the way, I can't recommend David's section in the Machinery Freedom on the hard cases highly enough. It only came, I believe, in the second edition, right? So I don't think that was in the first edition. But it's a great example of what philosophers called hypothetical reasoning. There is this long-standing view, oh, that's only hypothetical. Like, that's the only way that we can actually come to any deeper moral understanding. It was the use of well-crafted hypotheticals. I think the most basic one is, look, am I allowed to breathe on other people? It's like, I didn't get their explicit consent to breathe. Like, or what if they deny me? I explicitly deny you permission to breathe. I didn't, like, you're blowing atoms of air on me without my permission. It's like, okay, well, I don't need your permission. That's okay. I'm totally free to breathe. It's like, well, can you go and blow a jet engine in my face, which kills me? No, you can't do that. All right, so there is a line drawing problem. This is, of course, a general problem with deontological reasoning is they want to just pretend like the world is not continuous. And yeah, the world is continuous in a lot of ways. And you just have to accept that. There's no way around it.
My standard one is not breathing, but turning on the lights in your house.
Even funner, yes.
Because those photons are observable from miles around, and we certainly agree that a megawatt laser shown in your face would be an assault.
Excellent. So, Professor Friedman, the first time I believe I ever saw you speak was here in Madrid 6 years ago, and you were speaking about the historic cases of medieval Iceland and the law systems. And I believe you've spoken and written extensively about, historical cases that somewhat resemble libertarian or stateless systems. But what do you see as the strongest objections against relying on these examples as models for as models for today's world?
Yeah, I should say to begin with that my book, Legal Systems, is not really about stateless societies, although it includes some stateless societies. Its basic approach is that all human societies face more or less the same problems. They solve them in a variety of different ways, and they're all grown-ups, so you can learn for all of them. I don't think that there is a best under circumstances legal system, including I had some reluctance to put up my hand when you asked about anarcho-capitalism because there are environments in which it wouldn't work. I do not think I advocate anarcho-capitalism at the moment for Estonia, for example. So I think the two big problems with the stateless societies, some of which you can see in historical examples, some of which you can't. One of them is invasion by an adjacent neighbor, that national defense is a public good. There are imperfect ways of producing public goods, but we don't know if they'll be sufficient. That's why I would not advocate it for Estonia at the moment. And the other one is that if the number of if power becomes too concentrated, if the number of rights enforcement agencies becomes very small, then you have a situation where one or a coalition of them can hope to reinvent government on the grounds that robbery is going to be more profitable than producing services for people. And that's one way of reading the breakdown of the Icelandic system, that initially you had about 40 Gothar who are translated as chieftains, so that's misleading because there weren't any tribes. But they were people through whom you plugged into the legal system. And you ended up, by the end of the Sturlung period, with a situation where there were typically 3 or 4 coalitions, each of which controlled multiple Gothar, and therefore the conflict stopped being about you cut wood in my forest and you owe me some damages, or you killed my son and you owe me some damages, and became more about who's going to run Iceland when the dust clears. So I think those are at least it seems to me, the two main problems.
And I say the main problem is just the transition one. So if we were to press a button right now and abolish all police, courts in Spain without warning, I think it would be as bad as people imagine. It would just be blood in the streets. You can say that's a problem with anarchy, or you can say that it's a problem with very fast radical transitions with no warning. I think it really is the second story. So the real question is, if people were expecting a stateless system to exist, if it was already well established, would it be stable then? That's where I do think that the arguments are very strong. And it's just coming down to usual reasoning about if you were the one person in a system like that was working, that wanted to do something different, what would happen? My favorite example here is, imagine going back to Sweden in Viking times, 1000 AD. I don't know, is that Viking times?
Yes.
Okay, phew. All right. And you propose democracy. And you just say, okay, so, it's going to be a system where we will just go and take these votes, and then whoever gets the most gets to be the leader. And just imagine how much they would have laughed at you, because they would have said, like, whoever, it doesn't matter who wins, whoever is strongest will just kill the guy that won if it's not himself and take over. And that's a totally reasonable prediction in 1000 AD in Sweden. But imagine that you go to modern Sweden, you're the ruling party, and you say, I think if we lose the election, we should just kill the other side and continue to stay in power. And that's one where people would laugh for a different reason. Namely, it was just a ridiculous idea and no one would go along with it, or maybe they would just sort of shove you out of the room because you sound crazy, right? And then as to what's changed, right? What's changed is just that in 1000 AD, people were very used to the idea that you would just go and murder other people in order to take over. And now in Sweden, that idea seems really weird. And if the idea is really weird, to be the one person who disagrees means that the problem is yours, not the problem of the system. So that's really the question is anarcho-capitalism the kind of system where once established, if one person says, I don't like this, let's do something different, that person basically is helpless to go and change it, as long as people accept the general idea or not. And I think that it is just like democracy, where if people think it's going to last, it then has a lot of built-in stability.
The version of this that I've argued is that reestablishing government itself faces the public good problem. Werner Vinge has a very interesting short story, The Ungoverned, which is set in an anarcho-capitalist society more or less based on my model. And part of the fun of that is he's a science fiction author, not an economist. And he's therefore trying to portray believable human societies. And one of the striking things in that is the way in which each side, the anarchists and the statists who are invading them, take for granted their own view of the world. So that in his society, there are people who have opted out of the network of agreements. And one of them is a wealthy farmer whose son lost a case like 30 years ago. And he's just armed his farm, so it's a fortress. And the invasion army runs into that farm. In fact, I think a couple of kids lure them in that direction. And it never occurs to them that they could just walk around it, because they know a military establishment has to belong to the state, and even if they don't call it a state, it must really be a state. And eventually it turns out that his last-ditch defense is an atomic bomb, which he sets off over his farm with his family in a deep hole. And the invaders are shocked that anybody would use nuclear weapons, which is very taboo. And the representative of the local rights enforcement agency looks at him in sort of in puzzled way, and he says, but he's not my customer.
So speaking of science fiction stories, in Robert Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, there's a character called Mike who's like a self-aware computer who helps to organize a libertarian revolution. So given the current rise of AI, how long do you think it will be before we get our own Mike? And then furthermore, would you trust an AI system to help you govern or enforce rules in your ideal society?
I'm almost sure there's already dozens of mics. It's so easy to come up with a chatbot that will just simulate any viewpoint.
A revolution.
I think some of the people here would know better than me, but I'm almost sure these chatbots are already around. In terms of whether you can trust them, look, AIs give you output based upon the training data. Right? If you go to ChatGPT and ask it, well, suppose you've been trained exclusively upon ancient Roman manuscripts, how would you be different? And it tells you. It says, yes, well, I would express the views that were typical of Roman writers at the time. So it's something where if you think that the underlying training documents are at least, or training data is reasonably reliable, then it gives you good answers. Otherwise, it's not. So, something trained upon modern data, it's not going to be anarcho-capitalist, of course, because there's hardly any anarcho-capitalist. It doesn't matter whether it's true. It is good if you get more specific, because, of course, if you get more specific, then it's relying upon more specific training data. So if you ask it about anarcho-capitalism, it's going to know all about David, which is a big step up, in my view, than if it just thinks about it in normal terms. But
I would not trust it because you can't see the code. That is, if you had a super intelligent computer built on the model of a decade ago, where somebody figures out how to program a computer to be very smart, then in principle, if it was done well enough, you could say, well, I know that the rules for this computer don't allow for it to become a dictator. But given that the actual AI is more like real people in that respect, I don't think you can predict it.
I feel like this reflects more that David has a really strong math background, and so he can go through a mathematical proof and actually know it's correct. Whereas I would say I'm more empirical, and I would go through a math proof and like, do the smart people say it's right? I wouldn't have that much confidence. On the other hand, if I get to play around with something for a long time and it keeps giving me reliable output, I'm like, well, I don't know how it works, but it works, and that's good enough for me. In fact, in a way better than if I went over the code, because my ability to judge the code is not that good.
I would have said that the right way in these contexts to do it is not to ask what the right people say, but what the smart people say, but to find smart people on either side of the issue and watch them argue.
That's part of what I mean by ask what the smart people. Although, of course, in a lot of fields like math, it's really hard to get much of a debate going because the smart people are so convergent.
So, due to technological changes, I think in some ways we're living in a more and more extra-nationalist world, in the sense that there's more hyper-globalization and the possibility of living as a digital nomad, and geographical borders are playing a less necessarily defining role in people's lives. But we also see a lot of strong nativist and nationalist reactions to these kind of changes, because people who see themselves as being very, people who are beneficiaries of statism, they will react negatively or perhaps violently to perceived losses of, status or control and sovereignty. So, how do we navigate such reaction, as we pursue a freer world, a freer society?
If the only people who favored big government were the people who personally financially benefited from big government on balance, we'd have a great libertarian world already. Right? The whole idea of libertarians is that we could have a much better world overall. And if that were true, then most people, barring some strange distributional assumptions, would actually benefit from change. So the real problem is that there are a lot of people who would totally benefit from big reforms who are still against them. I have a book on housing. It is not true that only homeowners favor strict housing regulation that keeps housing prices high. Far from it. In fact, there is barely any difference in support between homeowners and tenants for strict housing regulation. An economist might just furrow his brow and say, but obviously, homeowners get some gain from the regulation, but the tenants are pure losers. That is not the way that psychologically normal humans perceive the situation. It's like, well, what are they thinking? It comes down to both tenants and homeowners just think government is protecting us from a whole bunch of things that might go wrong if people were free. And then you can go through and say, well, the things that you think would go wrong, they're unlikely, or at least that there's a bunch of good things that would happen that would more than offset it. And then on top of that, even if there were 20% of the population that were huge gainers, but they were blocking change, if it were just self-interest, we would just buy them out. It would be so easy. Right? The real problem is false beliefs about what policies are beneficial for society. So I see that as the big issue. In terms of how much is changing the world, there are a lot of changes that are really great for a small number of people who hang out here, and that's great. So how many digital nomads have we got around here? Right, so expecting more, but anyway. But digital nomads are a tiny share of the global population, unfortunately. It's great that this new freedom is showing up. If it affects only 0.1% of the world's population, that's still 8 million people having better lives. Wonderful. At the same time, I don't think that it's going to be a huge deal. I was just talking with David before here on the theme of, look, it's even U.S. citizens find it very hard to legally work in any other country. There's a giant process in order to do it. So you might think, well, why does Spain even care? Hardly any Americans want to move to Spain and get a job. Spain cares. What are you trying to pull, you sleazy Americans, trying to come here in Spain and work? when you have a digital nomad visa, a big part is, wait, can you prove that you won't be producing anything that is consumed in Spain? All right, then it's okay. But you want to contribute to the Spanish economy? No, terrible, let's stop him. That's the mentality of the regulations. It's great that there's any relaxation. But I don't think that worsening policy is really a response to changing facts. I think ideology is mostly just free-floating nonsense, and it's basically, it's like a conversation about Middle Earth. It's barely connected to reality. There's some internal logic to it, like what's said next has to be related to what's said before. But other than that, not really.
But you shouldn't be surprised, because there is no reason why it is in the interest of an individual to hold correct opinions on political issues.
I couldn't agree more. Someone should write a book on it. But it is so taken for granted. I have heard a bunch of talks right here at LibertyCon where people say, the reason this is happening is because of some fact. And I'm like, that fact always existed, so it should have happened already. It's like, well, it's because people noticed a fact. It's like, well, does the fact they noticed it mean that it became more common or anything else? Like,
But let me point out the difference between the attitude to having Americans working in your country and the attitude to learning English. That from the standpoint of the individual outside of France, he has no reason to have a correct opinion on how useful it would be to allow Americans to produce. But he does have a reason to how useful it would be for him or his children to learn English. That's a private good. And there, the observation is that whatever the nationalistic attitudes are, with the possible exception of France, though I'm also told it's true of Spain, but I haven't observed it there. Most people are perfectly happy to have the idea that they're going to have English as a second language.
Totally correct. Full agreement.
Excellent. So at the beginning of the session, Professor Caplan, you raised your hand for minimal states, I believe.
No, I did this, indicating that I don't want to push a button to get rid of the government right here, right now, because I don't want to die.
Okay,
and I don't want to. On the other hand, that it's like if it were accepted as a viable idea and were already in place, then I think it would work well.
And what would it take, theoretically or empirically, for you to become fully convinced of anarcho-capitalism, for example?
See it happening in one country in the modern world. That would really help. Yeah, like Iceland's great. Love Iceland. But it's like a really long time ago, so it's not, it's less convincing than if it were happening right now in some other notable country. I'd also want to go to the country. I mean, step one is like, well, are they dying? I don't want to go there. But then once there, I'd like to look around. In terms of amazing countries to go to, so you go to United Arab Emirates. I'm doing my open borders debate there. If anyone tells you it can't work in the modern world, it's like, I've been in a country that was 90% foreign-born, and it's awesome, and it's just the way I would have predicted.
Okay, and Professor Friedman, what would it take, theoretically or empirically, for you to disavow anarchism?
The problem is that I would only disavow it in the sense that I already have. That is to say, I concede that there are environments in which it wouldn't work, and it is very hard to see how I could have any evidence that there are no environments in which it does work. So I guess what it would really take would be a theoretical argument. I'm really a theorist, and I think the only place where I've made a noticeable change in the theory was due to Jim Buchanan's critique of machinery. Jim Buchanan, who later was a colleague of mine, wrote what I think of as the only good review of Machinery of Freedom, where I define a good review as one that makes the author think. And he pointed out that there was something I had left out in my analysis, and it took a while, and unfortunately he was no longer alive when I published the third edition, but the third edition contains the revisions, the problem that he raised, and my response to it.
Yeah, I mean, whereas I would say if you had 10 anarcho-capitalist countries and things seem to be going well and they all collapsed in a short amount of time, I'd say, pretty convincing that it's not going to work.
Okay, so we can move on to some audience questions now. So please raise your hand We've got a gentleman at the front here, I think, raised his hand first. Please, when you ask your question, state your name and which of our panelists your question is aimed at.
Hi, my name's Oliver, and I don't really mind who answers, but perhaps Bryan, just out of any choice. Would you still pursue freedom if it meant a certain reduction in wealth?
Yeah, so I mentioned this idea of weak deontology, saying that there are some moral principles that you should follow even if there is a net reduction in wealth, but if it's big enough, then no. Right? So it's one thing to say, all right, we should go and respect the right of free speech even if it leads to a 2% fall of GDP. It's like, all right. What if it leads to a 99% fall of GDP? It's like, that's too much. So that's the main way that I think about it. So again, like if you go to David Friedman's chapters on the hard cases, like, is it wrong to steal? Yes, presumptively, it's definitely wrong to steal. Like, what if you're going to starve? What if you're starving? Well, how long have I been starving? All right, so it's like 3 hours. No, you can't go and break into someone's house and steal food when you've only been hungry for 3 hours. Like, what if you're on the verge of dying? It's like, yes, then it's okay. All right, so that's the where I think about it. So there's a presumption. If there is a large loss in the net welfare of the world as a result of following the rule, then I think that you should break the rule. But if there's just a small one, then I think you should still stick to it, assuming the rule is a good one in the first place.
And I make that argument again, although I don't think I used the starving to death.
I was sure you didn't have starving cabin. Breaking into a cabin. You have breaking into a cabin.
That's right.
But not from starvation, for some other reason.
Okay, question?
Hello, I'm Matteo from Italy. Thank you very much for your talk. Just one question. Outside of this room where everybody believes in here, so you were kind of like speaking to the converted already, but outside of here, also from personal experience, I've tried the Friedman approach from an utilitarian point of view. I also tried the humor approach from an intuitionist, ethical intuitionism point of view. I also tried the Caplan approach from a more problem-by-problem basis. And I've been faced with the same problem of irrationality from my opponents, pretty much, that no matter how I try to convince them, there were like really no way to getting through the idea that freedom actually leads to better alternative, leads to better ethical, from the ethical point of view, leads to better outcomes. Nothing sticks really. So how actually are we supposed to go outside from this room and start convincing people? What is your point?
Yeah, I mean, step one is just lower your expectations. You're right. It's extraordinarily hard to change people's minds about anything. My dad has a long list of terrible views, and eventually I realized, wow, I'm not going to change his mind on any of this stuff. Not at all. And this is my dad. My dad loves me. I mean, I've told him, like, Dad, if I had a son like me, I would be talking about him all the time, about how great he is and how it proves that what a great father I was, just to get some stolen valor. But that doesn't persuade my dad either. So anyway, step one is just realizing it's really hard, because if you keep doing something that's really hard, but you imagine that it's easy and if you were any good, you would succeed, it's very, very demotivating. So you just have to, step one, just realize how hard it is. In terms of like actual persuasion, the very best, most evidence-based approach I know just comes from Dale Carnegie's classic book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And it comes down to become a really likable person. And like, how do you become a really likable person? By trying to like other people first. Unilaterally make an effort to like other human beings. Right? And I say this not because I'm especially good at this. When I was 18, I was one of the worst libertarians you could imagine, just yelling at people and talking down to them and telling them what a bunch of fools they were. I would tell my mom, Mom, when will you get it through your thick skull that the minimum wage is bad? So look, I was a sinner. I failed. But anyway, I've improved. This is a great book. Like, no one cares what you know until they know that you care. So I know Matteo was telling me about talking with his girlfriend's friends, and it's like, look, I think you got to apply more of that Matteo charm. Like, you'll spend less time talking about the stuff that bothers them and just get to know them better as human beings, so that when they see you, they have a big grin on their face. That's Matteo. He's such a cool guy. And once you've got that, That's the least bad scenario for people listening to you. In terms of persuading others, empirical arguments are best for a narrow issue. I have definitely changed people's minds who have broad philosophical disagreements with me because there's a very particular issue that we both know a lot about, and I'm able to go and say, look, minimum lot size regulations are bad, and this is where, like, even if they don't know that original issue, they know the general issue. That's the kind of thing that's specific enough to win someone over on the facts. If you try going up to higher levels, then it is really hard. If you just want to learn from success, so probably the two most successful libertarians in terms of changing minds of the whole 20th century were Milton Friedman, who mostly did empirical arguments, although it's mixed with a lot of the rhetoric of freedom, and Ayn Rand, who was, though she would hate the word, was super deontological, although she also went and wrote stories where failing to have free market policies led to disaster. So those are the two big success stories. So learn from success, but also just try to become as likable as you can find it in your heart to do. And here's the thing, if that sounds really hard, baby step it, practice, gamify it. Like honestly, so I read Dale Carnegie when I was in high school and I realized it was all true, but I was just too immature to listen. And then like 25 years later, I reread it and like, damn, why didn't I just do what Dale said? But it is like, once you take that book to heart, just saying, okay, I'm going to try to put a smile on the face of the person checking me in at the hotel right now. I'm going to see if I can pull that off. That kind of practice, just when you internalize it, when you are just thinking about other human beings and trying to put yourself in your shoes, in their shoes rather, of this person's probably had a really tough day. Have you ever been at an airport and there's a delayed plane and people are screaming at the flight attendant? And like, if it doesn't occur to you, like, it is not that person's fault. That person is miserable listening to this, trying to go and placate people. And if you could just somehow make that person's day a little bit better by saying something to them, that would be some valuable practice, which then might one day lead to the abolition of the minimum wage. I don't know.
Two points. First, of the two most effective libertarians you mentioned, only one of them was likable. And was extraordinarily likable, I should say, which is one reason why he was friends with Galbraith and Buckley and lots of other people.
Well, your dad did send me a really angry email about a year before he died.
But the other thing I wanted to say is on the subject of preaching to the converted, because I generally try to avoid doing that. And usually when I'm speaking to libertarian audiences, I try to argue for either something they haven't thought of or something they disagree with. Unfortunately, I think there are too many anarcho-capitalists in this room for that to work anymore. So I've failed in that respect. I was thinking that maybe the next time I do a speaking trip, I should make a point of finding objectivist groups to whom I can offer my argument of why Ayn Rand's philosophical position are wrong, and Austrian groups to whom I can offer my arguments about why Rothbard's economics is nonsense.
Yeah, so by the way, so all of my books are written for non-libertarian audiences. So of course, libertarians tend to like them, but my imagined reader when I'm doing it is not someone from this room. My imagined reader is just a reasonable person that is willing to listen to me, and I try to go and talk to them that way. And here, look, it sounds too good to be true, but I have changed the minds of a lot of people who have very strong philosophical disagreements with me on a lot of specific issues. The idea that once there's a slippery slope and once they agree with me on one thing, then they're going to start agreeing with everything, that's fantasy. That doesn't happen, unfortunately.
Okay, any more questions? Over here? Oh, sorry, please.
I think it's not. Yes? Oh, it's working. Sorry. Thank you so much for your talk. It was very enriching. Thank you, Professor Friedman, for the picture before the talk again. I wasn't thinking to make a question. I'm here from Madrid, Spain, but well, I couldn't before, so I'm gonna take the chance. This is about radical visions for liberty. So, which would you say is a powerful action to support radical visions in favor of liberty nowadays? I know it's very generic, but I wasn't thinking about it.
Sorry, I missed a word at the beginning of the sentence, right before visions of liberty.
Yeah, which will you say is a powerful action to support radical visions in favor of liberty nowadays?
A powerful action. I mean, I don't recommend this to anyone, but like self-immolation, burning yourself alive, gets a lot of attention. Overthrew the government of Tunisia. Don't do it. Don't do it. But in terms of like other stuff, so probably like in terms of stuff that is actually going to be a net benefit to you, it is publicly betting other people. This is one of my main hobbies. Right now I have a perfect track record of 23 wins for 23 resolved public bets. Bets do get people's attention because you get the buy-in of a person that disagrees with you. That's important. If you just go and make a prediction, you can say something that is so bland that, of course, you're going to be proven right. But for a bet, you got to find someone who, on another side, who says your terms are acceptable, your odds are acceptable, and when the bet resolves, it does actually change the minds of reasonable people who had not made their minds up before. Of course, it's especially powerful in the rationalist community, which is a small community that punches way above weight. So not to be neglected. But even people that are not really into betting, still, it's a story of two people thought different things, they clearly laid it out, and one was proven right. That's a good story. The main intellectual objection, so Tyler Cowen doesn't like my bets, because it's like, well, you just got lucky the times that you beat me, Brian. Or maybe. Did I get lucky 23 times in a row? Okay, maybe, but seems really unlikely. It sounds like I actually have proven, not just other people, I've convinced myself I have good judgment. Because otherwise, like, I don't know, do I have good judgment? Like 23 out of 23, all right, that's pretty damn good. Like, what seems to me to be true probably is true.
Okay, the clock here says 15 minutes, but have we got time for one more question? Or, yeah? Got a question over here.
Yeah, just on the topic of talking to those we disagree with, I wanted some advice. So I'm going to a Marxist talk next week by a guy named Slavoj Zizek. When speaking to my hopefully new friends in the audience and Slavoj himself, what should I ask and what approach would you guys take?
Yeah, I think the Marxist audience is totally hopeless. With one exception. Like, if you talk to the youngest Marxist in the room, there's hope for that person. So, like, there's a lot of social science on people almost basically lock down their fundamental views between the ages of 15 and 25. So those are really the only ones that are still open to persuasion. I have met people who are Marxists who change their minds at that age. In terms of people who change their minds at later ages, that's really rare. Look, I think you're much better off going to conferences of moderate people. Like moderate views of any kind, going to the most extreme view that you disagree with, like it might be really entertaining, but in terms of changing minds, right? So I assume it's not something where you're actually going to get injured. If it's like a protest and you show up with another sign and think there's just going to be a dialogue, yeah, maybe it's not just going to be a dialogue. So don't put yourself in grave danger just to prove a point. But per my don't self-immolate thing, too. Don't do that.
The people who changed China from a communist society to a more or less capitalist society were mostly not young.
There's an interesting fact, which is Mao spent decades saying, we must find and root out the capitalist roaders who are infiltrating the Communist Party itself. And he sounded like a paranoid lunatic, which he was, but turned out he was right on that point. There were a bunch of capitalist roaders within the Communist Party of China. As to when they actually really realized what a dumb idea communism was, it probably varies a lot by communist. I think Deng was probably pretty early on realizing that these policies were really dumb. They're also just seeing the incredible success of Hong Kong and Taiwan put a bunch of capitalist roaders in the Communist Party because it was just so blatant and so obvious. And also the Great Leap Forward. That was a famine that was probably maybe the most deadliest famine in all of human history. And it was one where the Communist Party leaders in China, they saw like the dead bodies piling up, many of them. That's, so maybe actually those Marxists, if they just saw the dead bodies, that would actually make them rethink. But talking's not going to do it. It's got to be horror.
The other thing, which may or may not work for your rhetorical purposes, is providing an intellectual middle road. Because part of what I think happened in China was that they observed places like Yugoslavia, which called themselves Marxist, but did not follow the Marxist model. And they therefore concluded, yes, Marxism is right, but we obviously have the wrong kind of Marxism, and they ended up with a kind of Marxism that was capitalism.
Okay, I think we need to leave it there, gentlemen, I'm afraid. But fantastic advice. Thank you so much for your time. Everyone. Yeah. So befriend a billionaire and don't self-immolate.